Hello, everyone. We're about to get started. I'd like to welcome you to today's session, Reaching New Heights, the Sky's the Limit with NISO Projects in Transparency and Trust in the Scholarly Ecosystem. My name is Keandra Bailey. I'm the Assistant Standards Program Manager at NISO, and I am joined today on the panel by Caitlin Baker of the University of Regina, who is also the co-chair of the CREC working group, Hilke Koers of STM Solutions, and Patrick Hargett of Adapon and co-chair of the JAV Revision working group. So I'd just like to remind you all of the code of conduct. I know it's late in the day, you've heard this a million times. I won't take up your time too much with that. So today we are going to discuss three NISO projects, two recent recommended practices, and one ANSI NISO standard, the communication of retractions, removals, and expressions of concern, aka CREC, recommended practice, the recently revised and fresh from its public comment period journal article versions, aka JAV, and the standard terminology for peer review. I don't like to assume that everyone in this room knows what NISO is, so I'm going to give a quick introduction of what NISO is. NISO, which is the National Information Standards Organization, is a nonprofit industry trade association accredited by the American National Standards Institute, the aforementioned ANSI, with members across libraries, library organizations, publishers, publisher organizations, vendors, suppliers, other intermediaries, and many others. We publish a variety of documents, which include standards, recommended practices, technical reports, and white papers. NISO is volunteer-driven, and all of our outputs are consensus-based. So why is consensus important in standards and recommended practice development? And what does it mean for our work to be consensus-based? In discussing these projects today, it's important to note that all three possess a goal of clarifying inconsistencies around processes and workflows and providing guidelines to clarify how to handle metadata that may vary across organizations. So how do you seek to solve a problem that involves different workflows, organizations, people, and industries? By engaging these constituencies in the actual process of creating a solution. By developing and publishing community-driven solutions, we create common ground between us regardless of our background or industry, opening the lines of communication and building trust and consistency across organizations creates a shared community of practice that allows more timely dissemination of corrective information, as we'll discuss with CREC, and information to use. In providing a space for organizations to reach consensus, NISO serves as a bridge to adoption of best practices across the information landscape. With that, I'd like to hand it over to our first presenter, Hilke Koers.
Thank you so much, Keandra, for that setup. And good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here back in Charleston. So my name is Hilke Koers. I'm the Chief Information Officer for STM Solutions. And before I get started with the presentation, I wanted to mention that I am presenting this work really instead of my colleague Joris van Rossum, who was the chair of this NISO working group that developed the work that I'll be speaking about, the peer review terminology, but he wasn't able to come to Charleston on this occasion. So that's me. So you'll see that the initial presentations that we have prepared, they follow a similar structure, starting with, I think, what is a good point to start with, what is the problem that we are trying to solve? And for this work, for the peer review terminology, that really has to do with transparency and trust around the peer review process. Now, as you all know, peer review is one of the hallmarks of scholarly publishing. But behind that simple term, peer review, there is really a world of complexity and a lot of variation. And in particular, we have seen over recent years that there's a significant number of new peer review models that have been introduced, in particular in open peer review. The article that's quoted here on the right mentions more than 122 distinct definitions according to their work. In principle, that variation, that diversity, is not a bad thing at all, but we do think there is a risk that comes with it that it might introduce confusion with people not understanding exactly what is meant with the word, with the label peer review in a specific context. And then in turn, that confusion could lead to erosion of trust. Or, if I'm stating that in a more positive tone, being clear and being precise about what exactly is meant with that label peer review in a particular context contributes to openness, transparency, and therefore by trust in the scholarly publication process. So addressing this challenge really required collaborative effort for a couple of reasons, two of which are listed here on the slide. The first, just because there is a lot of work involved and it makes sense to join forces. The second is also we understand that for such a standard to be really widely accepted, it really has to be carried by the community. And the best way to make sure that it's carried by the community is really to develop something in a collaborative way with the community. So what's the solution that we have come up with? We've developed some form of a rubric which proposes a standard terminology for peer review based on 4 key aspects that I will briefly go through. The first aspect is around transparency of identities. And this describes which identities are known and which identities remain unknown in the peer review process. For example, single blind, double blind, triple blind, completely open. The second aspect pertains to whom the reviewer communicates with during the peer review process. Is that only with the editor, or is that also with other peer reviewers, or perhaps with the author? The third aspect sees to what information is published about the peer review after the work is formally published. And that could include review reports, that could include summaries, reviewer identities, or nothing at all as pertains to the peer review process that went ahead. And finally, the fourth aspect is really about modalities for post-publication commenting insofar that is applicable. So what's the call to action that I'd like to leave the audience with? Well, first of all, we hope that you will find the terminology useful as you speak about peer review in internal and external communications, and that it helps to provide transparency about what kind of peer review is applicable in certain contexts, certain journals, certain articles, etc. And secondly, for the publishers in the room, you are, of course, encouraged to implement the terminology in your communication about the peer review process, both at the journal level, but also at the article level. Thank you, and with that, I'll hand over.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Backer. I am the Discovery Technologies Librarian at the University of Regina. I also had the pleasure of co-chairing the NISO CREC working group. So starting today talking about what the problem actually is. If you don't know what you're looking at, that's actually kind of the problem. So the challenge is that there is a great deal of inconsistency when we think about retracted publications and how those publications are shown across different databases, across different platforms. And whether or not the fact that it is retracted is even shown. About 50% of articles that are retracted aren't indicated as such in the various platforms through which they're available. So the visualization that's on the screen right now is showing the different locations where something is indicated to be retracted in different databases. So it could be in the title, it might be in a banner, it could be in the abstract, it might be in controlled vocabulary, they could have a bespoke field or a field that they're repurposing, or maybe not at all. And so there is this tremendous inconsistency across databases, but also within databases as well. So to give you a sense of what that actually looks like, so this is a screenshot from one database of 3 retracted publications. The screenshots were all taken within probably about 30 seconds of each other. In one case, retracted article is amended in the title. In 2 cases, there's an update notice, although neither update notice actually uses the word retraction. One calls it a corrigendum, the other calls it an erratum, so you wouldn't necessarily know. And it's not visible in the screenshots, but in 2 cases, the publication type has been updated to be retracted, whereas in another case, it's still article. And so I will also note, this is from one database. It's not to pick on that one database. This is literally in every single database. We see this issue to varying degrees. And, it is somewhat understandable when you think about a large database, an aggregator receiving multiple streams of metadata from different publishers in different formats. There's going to be a level of inconsistency that we would probably expect to see manifesting. However, we also see that even within individual journals, there can be inconsistency in the way that things are presented as well. So these are 3 retracted publications from Psychological Reports. They were all published between 93 and 95. They were all retracted in 2020 and 2021. In one case, the word retracted is added to the title, and the abstract has been replaced with the retraction notice, and there's also a link to the retraction notice itself. In another case, there's a link to the retraction notice, and in the third case, there isn't anything. And so this is going to create confusion for end users. Think about what it is that the average researcher, the average student would need to do in order to know that something was retracted. They would need to, A, be aware that they have to do any of these things, but B, they would also need to be looking in multiple locations on every single page that they're interacting with, and then they would need to look at different resources. So they would need to look at the publisher site and then various databases just to double check and make sure, because just because it's not in one place doesn't mean it's not in another place. People aren't going to do that. Usually, most people are just going to put their trust in what it is that they're seeing. They're going to assume that the article as it is presented to me through my database or on a publisher site is in fact the representation of the article. And this may in part contribute to or it could be a contributing factor to why it is that oftentimes when we look at how retracted research is later used, people don't indicate that it's been retracted. It's only about 5% of citations to retracted publications actually show any indication of the fact that people are aware that there, is something questionable about this research. So it is a complex problem and one that required a collaborative solution. Because after all, if librarians like myself come up with a solution, it might work for us, might not work for the publisher because we don't necessarily have that perspective of how that data is being transmitted and produced. Publishers come up with a solution, it might not work for aggregators, and so on and so forth. We have multiple actors who are kind of working in this space and to an extent kind of compounding the problem. And so we need to have multiple actors who are also providing insight into what the solution can be. And so the solution that we're proposing is the NISO CREC Recommended Practice. So this was released this past June. And this was the product of over 2 years of work by 34 different people. And we had publishers of different disciplines, different sizes, journal editors, researchers, librarians, web vendors, aggregators, all sorts of folks, speaking about what it was that they currently do in their practice and where there were opportunities to potentially align and move things forward. So the RP itself, and I am not going to attempt to summarize the entire document. I am, however, going to encourage you to go read that. It covers the creation, the transfer, and the display of metadata related to retractions, but also to expressions of concern and removals. And while it does primarily focus on kind of the article version of record, it does also address other types of outputs as well. And the focus is really on the actions to be taken, but we also highlight who's responsible for the different actions, even including a RACI matrix. And we do also try to address some known complexities, so things like journals that have been transferred from one publisher to another, articles that get retracted when they're still EPUB ahead of print, those variations that were coming up in the conversations as being known issues. And finally, we do also not only outline the different metadata fields and how they can be interpreted and used to create something that's mutually intelligible, but we also have examples of metadata in both JATS and Crossref format to show how it is that the RP can be implemented. So in terms of what you should know and what you should do with this information, as I said before, please go read the RP if you haven't yet had the opportunity, and perhaps some things to reflect on as you're reading the RP. You know, for those of you who maybe are more on the vendor side of things, perhaps thinking about your current holdings and how many items you have, whether those are metadata only or full text that are associated with a retraction or with an expression of concern, and how it is that somebody would become aware of that information. And thinking about your metadata flows as well. Who are you pushing information to and who are you getting information from? And when you need to update that, how does that happen? What do those processes look like? And then for those of you who are more on the librarian side of things, thinking about what those vendor practices currently are. How will your users become aware of the fact that something has been retracted or an expression of concern has been issued? And is there an opportunity for advocacy if you're noticing inconsistencies there? And raising those inconsistencies to your vendors and showing that you are aware of this issue and that this is an issue. And finally, thinking about our own practices as libraries. Many of us, myself included, our libraries have publishing services. We run OJS, we run, institutional repositories. When there's some sort of update that needs to happen in those venues, what are we doing and what practices are we implementing to ensure that we're upholding the scholarly record? And on that note, I will turn it over to Patrick.
Hi. It's the last session of the day. Very glad to see everybody here. And I'm going to talk about the journal article version, which I'm co-chairing with Clay Burgett from American Chemical Society and Mike Nason, who's a librarian from the University of New Brunswick. And myself, I am a vendor. I'm responsible for the product that @Fun builds, which hosts many of the journals that are served. That's where people go to read content, so it's extremely important in terms of the display. So I'll come back to that, why we have a librarian, a publisher, and a vendor on this as co-chairs. So the journal article version recommendation was first published in 2008. It was defined so that we could understand what stage an article is in its creation, from author's manuscript to a submitted manuscript to an accepted manuscript. There's a proof and then a version of record. And then there was a correction, there was an enhancement of the version of record. These were the stages defined. There were many use cases defined, and it was very much a traditional publisher flow for articles from author to publication. And since 2008, which was a first manifestation of article publications online, it's been about 10 years since the electronic versions had started really coming out there. I think it was about 3-4 years ago, a new request was done to update the recommendations because of evolving models, preprints becoming a real reality, different types of publication models like PRC, publish, review, then curate. There's also some inconsistencies about how to identify, how to cite the different versions. So the DOI became a point. There was a request to, can you clarify how DOI should be used across different versions? And so this sort of need to create a new standardization definition. Well, it's not standardization, it's a recommendation. We have to understand, we recommend, we don't say that this is the way. Maybe in 10 years, this recommendation could turn into a standardization. But that was the mission that we were given, to go and improve these recommendation. So I said there's co-chairs, there's a vendor, there's a publisher and a librarian, because it's important as we define these recommendations that we get the input across the board, from the authorship to the display and how it will be published and produced. The publisher decides how it's going to be displayed, the vendor implements that, it provides solutions to improve that display, and the authors need to know what's happening with their article. The librarians need to understand that, and they're the ones who coordinate with the authors. The group came together, and as this recommendation update happened, there was a desire to open up the web of this recommendation so that it would be a little more inclusive about these new publication models, from PRC to the preprints, how to handle this. So the librarian became very important. And we brought together, as you see on here, people from many different organizations, even publishers that are practicing more open publishing, new novel ways of preparing articles, doing the reviews, post-publication reviews, for example. And so this became more and more important in the discussions. During the practice of preparing this recommendation were very interesting, because we had traditional views of how an article goes through the flow and some sort of more novel ways that we had to find ways to adapt to. Now, it's important to say this recommendation is not final. We published the draft in July and got feedback, and now we're processing all the questions and answers and comments, to this recommendation. The recommendation itself was introducing some more novel approaches. So we realized that when talking about the stages of an article throughout its life cycle, these are not versions, they produce versions, but these are stages in the life cycle. So we rename that from versions to stages, introduce the concept of a stage. We also introduced this concept of, well, this is very publisher-centric. What about how does the consumer view these stages? And so we introduced this consumer view, which you can see in this table here, where you have the pre-acceptance, post-acceptance, and sort of the formally published article. And these three phases of the article are sort of fundamental. Now, what happens inside of that, what does it mean to be accepted or not to accept, that's up to the publisher to decide. And the policies of that publisher to establish for example, an accepted manuscript means that it has to be peer-reviewed. Well, that's not necessarily true. Some publishers decide that acceptation is that we take responsibility of it. We've done a sufficient editorial review that we trust, and we can make it a version of record. It's sort of contentious. In a more traditional publishing flow, you would expect that something that's a version of record is peer-reviewed. But the group did not want to associate how you trust the article versus the stages of the article in its life cycle. And that's one of the sort of discussions that are ongoing, and some of the comments we got back on the recommendation that we're still parsing through and trying to provide some general recommendations for allowing more innovative processes in article review and ability for trust to be established. And that trust is something that is changing, right? You have AI models that can establish verifications of articles, for example. But the peer review is also a very strong signal of trust, but not necessarily the only signal of trust. The third important recommendation we brought in here was semantic versioning. So we did keep the concept of versioning, but we moved it into what we call semantic versioning. Semantic versioning is used in software. It's, you can say, version 1.1.2, 1.1.3. Everybody has a version of their iPhone OS or Android OS, you know, but there's these semantic version breaks down that that identification where you have the first number being the major version, the minor version, and some, you know, more insignificant changes. And within an article, we introduced that a major version could represent some significant change in the actual output of that research. A minor version could mean there's some change of importance. It might be a correction, but without significant impact. And a third level would be maybe some metadata corrections, an author name change, or something like this. It is up to the publisher to decide what is the policy they want to use when using semantic versioning. And then there were some other recommendations that we put in there. We've added in some JATS examples, how to mark up the version in a PDF as well. Recommendations about DOI usage and how with semantic versioning, DOI changes are not as important because the semantic versioning allows you to cite a very specific version together with a single DOI. So you could keep a single DOI and use the semantic version to point to that explicit version of the article. So that's part of the transparency that we get out of that and in this recommendation. There's also a whole section about preprints and how preprints are not necessarily a stage. And we had a large debate about how preprints would they be a stage or would it not? And so there's preprint servers that host versions of records, the preprint servers that have submitted manuscripts on them. So it all bound as a different delivery platform as opposed to a version or a stage of the publication. And lastly, moving forward, assuming that the recommendations will be accepted and published, the actions that will be required are introduction of that semantic versioning. Publishers will have to define their policy about what semantic versioning means. What's the major version? What's the minor version? What's that sort of build version, as they say in the software industry? Or do you only want to have 2 levels of that versioning? Citations will start including that version number, for example. There's also the adjustments for these new publication models. So it has to be explicitly clear what it doesn't mean that your version of record could potentially not be peer reviewed. How does that work? How do you establish the trust? That is something that needs to be clear from the publisher point of view, but there may be some other additional tools that need to be built, maybe another standard that establishes how do you mark an article in terms of its trustworthiness. And there will be some system upgrades because to include another new piece of metadata such as semantic version number, potentially there's some infrastructure changes that have to happen. And I think that's that, and we'll move over to a Q&A.
So before we swing into Q&A, because we also know it's late in the day, we thought of some questions first that, so as not to put too much burden on the audience. So my first question is, what are some challenges with adoption? How can an organization overcome those challenges? Hilke, would you like to start?
Sure, happy to start there. So applying that question specifically to the peer review terminology, I think it's fair to say we don't see or heard about any insurmountable obstacles or issues or challenges. But you know, as any type of adoption process, it takes time and effort and a bit of patience and a bit of push here and there. Specifically for the peer review terminology, I think that splits into 3 components of work that need to be done. The first is to map internal models that probably already exist about the type of peer review that is being done in a specific context, to map that internal system to the defined terminology. That's work that needs to be done. Then, of course, there's the implementation, the integration in systems, both in the back-end databases as well as the front-end. How do you relay this to your end users? And also, thirdly, which I think will apply to other aspects to other examples of standardization as well. There's communication, of course, right? Even things don't. You need to explain what's happening, and that is internal communication towards staff, towards people that work with the systems, but also external facing and to editors, etc., to make them aware and help them understand what the changes are that they will see as the standard starts to get integrated and implemented into the systems that they work with. So I think those are the 3 main components of the effort that is required. And I would hypothesize that that's sort of similar in other situations as well, but I'll let my fellow panelists comment on that.
Yeah, I would, I would agree that a lot of those challenges will likely apply to the adoption of CREC as well. I would say since CREC is so new, it just came out at the end of June, probably the big challenge at this point is really making that commitment to adopt, because there are existing workflows, there are existing practices internally for different publishers, for different vendors that, may need to be changed. And that requires potentially technical changes of making something possible, creating certain fields, but also workflow changes and personnel changes. And by personnel changes, I don't mean changing personnel, I mean changing attitudes and changing processes that people are engaging in. So I think that at this point will likely be the major challenge. Because it is so new, we don't necessarily have a lot of data about the specific issues people are encountering. I will mention that there will be a standing committee that's going to be forming, and they'll specifically be tasked with addressing questions about interpretation, about implementation. So they'll be able to not only gather, but also hopefully address those concerns moving forward.
Yeah, so with the journal article version recommendations, when they get approved, it will take probably some time for the adoption to happen. One thing is, if a publisher wants to start using semantic versioning, they may need to update their systems to be able to display that even alongside on the page with the article. It needs to be stored in the metadata. So we have recommendations in there of how that would happen in JATS and how that would be then displayed, what would need to happen. Preprint servers have been more active in using versioning already today. But usually it's a one-level version, 1, 2, 3, 4, not 1.1, not 1.2. So that might also introduce a tool that preprint servers might want to analyze and adopt. Policies need to be defined about what the semantic versioning means. In terms of the actual stages, I didn't mention that, but we removed the enhanced version of record and corrected version of record stage because we have semantic versioning which can represent that. That probably doesn't have much of an impact because the general consensus was very few publishers are actually were using these stages, but those that are using them would have to essentially move away from using enhanced version record or corrected version record and adopt the semantic version. So we do predict that it might take a bit of time for adoption. There'll be a period of analysis, understanding, and then sort of each publisher will probably start adopting this as well. Librarians, institutions will also probably find this useful because it will help them categorize and catalog the versions that are being submitted. It's the author's version, what was submitted to the publisher, what was finally the version of record, so they can know what is the actual article that they may store in their repository. Or, for example, if there's an update to the article, it's very easy then with a semantic version to know, oh, I'm holding an older version to this article because I can just look at that version number and I should go and pull up the latest. So all of this will take some time to adopt, but we do say that it will take probably less time than 15 years before we can have a new version of the recommendations. So we do expect there will be probably a standing group for that as well.
How does your endeavor support the goal of increased trust, accountability, and transparency? And what would success look like regarding this project in 1 or 2 years' time?
Same order, different order?
It's pointing to me that I think, with transparency, the importance is that we do see some sort of adoption. I think the semantic versioning is a really useful tool because it will allow researchers to cite specific versions. So if you are writing your references, you will include the semantic version, and there's a update that can be aligned. That can even be on a publisher. They'll be able to indicate, this article cites this version which is now out of date. even though it might not be. I think currently, for example, with getFTR, you can identify that a citation might be retracted. That's a very important indicator, but now you'll be able to say, oh, well, it's been updated. So something may have changed, which is, I think that's going to create a lot of transparency in the sort of communication, the exchange of articles in some fields, for example, in medicine, where a change in a version, a change in an article could save lives or could indicate that there was a mistake in an operation. Pointing to that specific version will be important. So I think that's huge importance in terms of transparency.
Yeah, and I would say, at least from the CREC perspective, I think really the foundation of what we were trying to accomplish was about enhancing transparency and enhancing trust, and just making sure that when somebody arrives at a record for an item, for an article, no matter what path they take to get to it, no matter where they're finding it, they're going to have complete context around what they're looking at in terms of its editorial status. They're going to know if somebody, if it has been retracted, if there is an expression of concern, and they'll be able to bring that into their interpretation of that item. In terms of what success would look like, in 2 years, if everything could just be fixed, that would be amazing. Unlikely, but if we can get a commitment to adopt, I think it's we never try and let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So even incremental change and improvement moving forward would be fantastic to see.
So yeah, just like for CREC, I think for the peer review terminology, transparency, openness are very much at the heart of it. And I would say the main premise of all the work is that transparency here really builds trust. And it is a good thing to be precise and to be articulate about what peer review means in a specific context, what the value is, what it delivers, but also what are some of the limitations and things that it does not do in that particular context. In terms of success, I think it was Ivan Orensky who reiterated the famous quote that it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. I'm an optimist, so I think the goal that we have in mind is to see really significant adoption, with maybe a significant majority of journals adopting this peer review terminology in 1 to perhaps 3 years. Let's reconvene in 2 years to see how far we've come.